on the recording. All right. Well, hello, everyone who is joining us today, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for the last of our presentations in our 6-part series exploring the National Park Service's criteria for establishing World War II heritage cities. Over the last 3 weeks, we've learned about the criteria for purposes of applications and evaluation by Park Service staff from the authors of our essay series on the topic. Today, we'll be hearing from Erica Fugger, and I will introduce her in just a moment, but I wanted to start with a few housekeeping issues, notes. This webinar is being recorded for anyone who could not attend all of the presentations or who wish to be able to review the materials being discussed. And we will send recordings of all 6 of our presentations out later this week to everyone who registered. Closed captioning has been enabled. If you don't see that automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just a reminder to please keep your microphone muted unless you've been called on to ask a question during the Q&A. And at any time, you can pop questions into the chat area of your Zoom window, and I will note them and help facilitate a Q&A with our speaker at the end. Last, before we begin the presentation, I wanted to give a warm welcome to Dr. Turkaya Lowe from the National Park Service for some words of welcome for us.
Good afternoon, good morning to everyone that's joining us. I am so happy to be able to participate in this webinar series. I'm Turkaya Lowe. I'm Principal Historian and Deputy Federal Preservation Officer for the National Park Service, managing the Park History Program out of our Washington Program Office. Just wanted to give a few words about the American World War II Heritage Cities Program, which is one of the co-facilitators and sponsors of the webinar series in partnership with NCPH. The legislation for the American World War II Heritage Cities was passed as part of the John Dingell Act of 2019. To recognize and ensure the continued preservation and importance of the history of the United States involvement in World War II. The Secretary of the Interior may designate only one city or jurisdiction per state or territory as an American World War II heritage city. We currently have 18 jurisdictions designated as World War II heritage cities. And you can learn more information about that on our program website, which we'll put a link in the chat for you. The legislative criteria for the designation are twofold. Contributions by a city and its environments to the World War II Homefront effort, and 2, achievements by a city or a jurisdiction to preserve the heritage and commemorate the legacy of the jurisdiction's contributions to the war effort and to generally preserve World War II history. So within these 2 broad categories, there are 15 topics or specific categories in the war effort contributions and in preservation and commemorative activities that were called out in the legislation. And we were so excited to partner with NCPH and the study authors to explore the broad topics more concretely to help with our analysis and interpretation of World War II Homefront history. So again, thank you for joining us for the webinar series. We hope that you have enjoyed the other presentations and looking forward to this one. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I am excited to introduce our speaker for today, who will be covering criteria 9, which is achievements by a city and its environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of the city's contributions to the war effort and to preserve World War II history. So today, here to talk with us about Criteria 9 is Erica Fugger, who is an oral historian and peace educator based in the New York City area. She actively works with organizations, communities, and families to implement historical documentation and dialogue initiatives. Erica previously managed Columbia University's Center for Oral History Archives and directed Washington College's World War II Public Memory Program, the National Homefront Project, which collaborated with diverse communities across the United States to document and preserve civilian experiences of the war. Her doctoral work at Rutgers University explores the lasting impacts of 20th century warfare and peace movements. So clearly a person in the right position to talk with us about Criteria 9 today. So thank you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Dr. Lowe. It's an honor to be here with you all today and speak about some of the different approaches and considerations when thinking about World War II preservation and commemoration initiatives. I'm just going to begin sharing my screen, and then we'll get into the presentation and a little bit of its structure today. All right. So many thanks to the National Park Service and the National Council on Public History for having me here to speak about the essay I wrote on Criteria number 9 of the World War II Heritage City Program. It's wonderful to have National Park Service and NCPH members here, selected site representatives and potential applicants. And I look forward to all of your questions following my short presentation today. To give just a little bit further of an introduction about my own background and kind of interest in this program, as Stephanie mentioned, I'm a historian. I'm currently based at Rutgers University, but a few years ago, I helped kind of craft and shape the creation of a World War II oral history program at Washington College in Maryland called the National Homefront Project. And this public memory initiative partnered with cultural institutions and community organizations across the country to preserve the voices of American civilians who experienced and contributed to the war. So as Stephanie mentioned, this is my entry point into this work, and especially in thinking through some different considerations of the criteria for the World War II Heritage City Program. It's often, my own experience is kind of guided by the outreach I did to these groups working on wartime heritage initiatives. So to just give you an idea of how the presentation is going to be structured, we're going to begin by looking just a little bit deeper into criteria number 9 and the kind of focus of this program. Then I'm going to go further in depth just with some examples of different preservation and commemoration efforts of the various categories that NPS has outlined. And then I'm going to wrap up by kind of sharing some historical perspective on preservation efforts, how they've developed and changed over the past 75 years, which might be helpful to keep in mind as you're considering applying to this wonderful program. A few kind of additional considerations and disclaimers. I'm listing the categories kind of based on the order that you'll see them on the NPS website. Some of the themes that I share, they're possible examples, but they're not the only ones that might consider applying to the World War II Heritage City Program. So really think creatively, about your own application. As you'll see, there's some overlap between different categories. So, just kind of keep that in mind as I'm describing some different examples. Also, I do not endorse any of the particular groups I'm making reference to, and the opinions I share are my own and not of NPS or NCPH. Overall, in this presentation, we're going to be thinking about ways, what makes a World War II memory site, preservation initiative, or commemoration effort unique, and how your city's contributions might be a good fit for this program. So I'm starting off here by just going a little bit deeper into, some of the different criteria, essays, some of these different, webinars that have been offered the past few weeks. These are the different themes you might consider, thinking about in terms of your own city and its wartime heritage. And I definitely encourage you to listen back to some of the recordings of other webinars, because they'll give you kind of a historical perspective on these different areas of World War II and different ways that your city may have contributed. And today I'm going to be speaking specifically around criteria number 9, which kind of relates specifically to the preservation efforts of heritage and legacy. And there's a number of different categories that we're going to be speaking about today. And that begins with looking at kind of memorials, museums, parks, different organizations that have recognized and commemorated the work of veterans and Homefront workers. We're looking at cultural events, different kind of structures and facilities from World War II, as well as kind of outreach efforts around wartime heritage and recognition ceremonies that have been put in place. So this kind of just gives you an overview of everything that criteria number 9 considers, and then I'll give some different examples that you might want to keep in mind in terms of your own city. So the first category I'm going to share about is around the establishment of memorials to area men and women who lost their lives in service. Some different areas to kind of keep in mind, even dating back to immediately following World War II, a lot of cities and towns created these honor roll plaques where the names of different service members who had lost their lives were dedicated and often installed in kind of public facilities. So, as you're thinking through your own application, maybe think about unique ways that your own city may have kind of created these sorts of plaques. Some more modern initiatives, there are kind of military tribute banners that a lot of different towns kind of put up in their downtown commerce districts. And this is kind of like a widespread initiative. So again, you might want to think about ways that your own city may have done a similar program and maybe a little bit differently. Especially over the past 30 years, there's been a real emphasis on developing memorials to service members who were lost in World War II. That memorial might be on the local, maybe the city or town level, could be on the state level, or in some ways it might also represent kind of national or international history and try to convey those different nuances to the public. So you'll see here one particular kind of memorial that's from Maryland. There's also other kind of monuments and statues that have been dedicated that just might be unique, based on your own individual city. So I definitely encourage you to kind of think about, what ways did you really innovate in how the history is preserved and told, and how these service members' lives have been honored. The second category that I'm going to speak about is the development of museums and parks and other kind of historical markers that were used to interpret and share World War II history. What's very popular is the development of different military museums. Some of these museums might focus specifically on World War II history, or maybe they'll be about kind of all different conflicts and the histories that pertain locally to the city or town where the museum is hosted. There's also kind of aviation museums, which collect together, different kind of aircraft and then interpret the history kind of through, that aspect of military history. There's battleship museums, veterans museums, and also this concept of memorials museum, which might, commemorate different aspects of wartime history, but it often has really an educational focus as well. And so a lot of these memorial museums, they might have a research center, an archive attached to them, and they might be running educational programming that's very kind of innovative and tries to reach out to new generations in the public. So those are just kind of some different considerations there, as well as ethnic museums, which kind of focus on the experiences of a particular group during the war effort. Some other considerations to keep in mind are this concept of living memorials. So I spoke before about these kind of honor roll plaques, and often they've been installed in kind of different public facilities. This was something that was very popular immediately following the war, especially as the US was kind of urbanizing and really kind of growing in the 1950s. So living memorials, really helped honor the history of the war, but also really think about the future. So that created, veterans memorial parks, memorial gardens, and also this concept of peace parks. And, again, these became public facilities that really tried to kind of engage another generation, and also to be, really civically minded. So it was a place to bring people together and to reflect also on those who served in the war. This concept of a peace park is especially unique. A lot of different towns kind of thought about, their individual experiences of warfare and how many lives were kind of lost in the war, whether it was American service members or, the millions that unfortunately perished during this conflict. And so the concept of a peace park is unique because it became a space to really reflect and try to prevent wars from happening in the future. They were really founded upon kind of international friendships. So sometimes there were even collaborations with Japanese representatives. And that became a very interesting way to continue to reflect on warfare, but also to think about, future possibilities for peace. And then the final category I'll share here is just around the idea of historical markers. And historical markers themselves, it's kind of similar to these honor roll plaques where they were embedded in a very particular site. It was often a site where the community would kind of, interact within that space. Maybe it was, a particular site that had a factory or some other form of that was specifically mobilizing towards the war. And so these historical marker programs, help commemorate different sites around the country that focus on World War II legacies, but they're often run on the state or local level. So it might just be helpful as you're thinking through your application, think if there were other programs that you may have been a part of that might set you up really well to apply for this NPS opportunity. This next category I'm going to be speaking about is around kind of events that have been hosted that bring veterans and Homefront workers together and recognize them for their service. So some different kind of examples are the concept of a tribute tour. You might be familiar with an honor flight that either brings World War II veterans back to their place of service or to the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. So these tribute tours, often try to engage veterans, but also Homefront workers like women, Rosie the Riveters. And so if you've been involved in this kind of initiative, I think it falls within this category of recognition. And it's really important to recognize, that there's a diverse range of service as well. And so, the kind of communities that you're engaging who contribute to the war effort is very important. There's some other kind of groups which have arisen over time. There's kind of different affinity groups that have tried to create kind of commemorative days for veterans and Homefront workers. There's different groups that also have kind of advocated for them to be recognized on the national level. But on the local level, there's often been kind of book clubs and social groups that have developed to try to bring veterans and Homefront workers together to reflect upon their experiences, to socialize a bit, to make connections with other local residents. And so that's really important in terms of thinking about, what were your unique approaches to kind of creating this sort of program, and how can it be recognized through this NPS opportunity. And then I'll just kind of finally wrap up this category by sharing particular recognition ceremonies. And so, there have been different efforts over the years to recognize veterans and Homefront workers, around particular wartime anniversaries, on Veterans Day, Memorial Day. And so these ceremonies, they can, be as simple as giving an award. It can also be around the installation of a historical marker or some other sort of, educational event with young people. And so that's where I said, sometimes these categories overlap a little bit, but these recognition ceremonies, are another way to kind of bring local residents together and honor their wartime service. So the next kind of consideration is the idea of kind of creating cultural events to remember and recreate World War II memory. So there's many different examples of this, and they're all very interesting. There's this concept of a tribute weekend. Sometimes different cities host this on an annual basis. Some different groups host these time period dances where everyone kind of dresses up as if it was the 1940s and kind of recreates some of the memory of World War II. There's also different air shows and wartime reenactments that happen across the country. And on the creative side of things, there can also be theater production, traveling dance troupes. And so those are all very interesting ways where a new generation of young people are trying to kind of keep the memory of World War II alive and to share it with different audiences in very creative ways. So that's kind of, if you've been involved in these kind of initiatives, this program doesn't have to be specifically around, sites, commemorative sites, but you can also think very creatively about these cultural events that you may have hosted. And I'll just wrap up here by sharing that, there have been some other very interesting ways over the years that, different educators have tried to kind of engage the World War II generation in sharing the history directly through their own experiences and stories. There have been a number of lecture programs at different universities and schools and public libraries where World War II kind of experts, historians, share about their research. But at the same time, there have been also opportunities where, the World War II generation themselves have actually, really taken time to share their stories. And that kind of helps intergenerationally ensure that, the nuance of war, these individual experiences of World War II are shared with a new generation. And often educators have embedded this within their classroom curricula, and even started kind of research projects and centers to kind of study different facets of the war a little bit further. So again, really thinking about these interesting cultural events, how they interact with educational initiatives, really, think about the many different ways that you may have been involved in sharing World War II history over time. All right, and so this next category, again, could overlap with military museums, because there may be museums that are kind of hosted on former, World War II sites, maybe even military bases, decommissioned bases, or kind of preserve different bunkers and things like that. So there's this category around the identification, preservation, restoration, interpretation of structures, facilities, and sites. So in addition to potential military installations, there may also be government facilities that are now kind of, no longer used by the government, but are have transitioned to become cultural institutions that have preserved and educated, locally about a city's contribution to the war effort. There's also different mobilization facilities, like factories, that may have been preserved over time, or the historical markers where those factories once stood and kind of helped with the wartime mobilization effort. And you often don't think of the American Homefront as including sites of conflict, but there are a number of different sites across the country, whether in Pearl Harbor, or whether this particular site in Delaware, where there was actually a German U-boat that landed on American soil. So it's kind of interesting to think, we really often focus on these kind of military bases, mobilization efforts, but actually there were particular aspects of the war that reached the American home front. So maybe in your particular city, there's multiple options here. So really make sure that you're kind of sharing, all these different aspects of your city's kind of wartime contributions. All right, and so this is another category that specifically focuses on kind of public relations and outreach around these World War II histories and legacies. And again, I think this is a really creative category because outreach can mean many different things, and so there's both print and electronic media that may have shared different facets of World War II history. So some different possibilities to keep in mind. There are different newspapers that kind of have focused around wartime anniversaries and sharing veteran stories. So there's some very interesting kind of investigative journalism, but also kind of human interest stories that have been featured in different print publications over time. There's also been kind of news broadcasts, radio programs, documentaries that have focused on different aspects of wartime history and maybe sharing the stories of particular cities as well. So those materials might be really helpful as you're starting to think through your application too. A lot of these programs, as technology has shifted, these stories have emerged and been shared in different ways. So there are kind of social media spotlights that have happened around kind of veteran stories and wartime anniversaries. There's whole oral history projects which have been mobilized to share the full spectrum of experiences of the war. And there's also very interesting archival preservation initiatives that have been kind of more grassroots mobilized, really trying to preserve local history from the ground up. And these have included kind of history harvest, preservation initiatives where local families are invited to come and kind of share their scrapbooks and their letters and photographs from the war. And so, it's just important to kind of think about, how you and your city have uniquely potentially, mobilized these kind of programs. Some other considerations here are exhibitions. These could be exhibitions within museums, like some of the different categories we covered, but they might also be kind of temporary exhibitions, opened up in a public space to share about local history. There could also be books and even multimedia websites that try to share, different aspects of the war. And so, I love this category because it just covers so much, and it really allows you to think, very creatively about ways that you may have represented this history already. Okay, so this final category here just goes a little bit deeper into this concept of kind of recognition ceremonies, especially surrounding wartime event anniversaries. So as I previously mentioned, there may be events that are kind of hosted around Memorial Day or Veterans Day. Those are some pretty big national holidays that kind of bring people together to reflect on wartime service. But at the same time, there's also different anniversaries, especially, the 75th anniversary of the end of the war was in 2020. So some of these ceremonies, had happened virtually at that time, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Others were resumed when it became safe to kind of bring veterans and Homefront workers together. But these recognition ceremonies have really been happening, over the past maybe 75 or past 25, 30 years, especially since the 50th anniversary of the war. And so, it'd be interesting to kind of consider in your particular town, has there been an annual event? Was there a very big ceremony to commemorate, an anniversary around a major battle or otherwise? And these recognition programs can also often become kind of dedication ceremonies of different monuments, memorials, historical marker sites. They're often kind of hosted by local or state government, schools and universities, public libraries and historical societies, and also veterans groups and retirement facilities. And so these become kind of different organizations that are really invested in ensuring that, the World War II generation, who today is, most often in their 80s, 90s, even over 100, that their service is honored and shared with a new generation. And so, just really kind of think about the different groups that have been invested in these efforts in your local city. And I think that pretty much kind of wraps up some of these different categories and different ways to kind of think about, how you may have uniquely contributed in your environment. And what I wanted to just briefly share was the concept of making meanings from these histories, and especially to give a little bit of historical perspective on how these wartime commemoration efforts have changed over the past 75 years and where they are today here in 2023. So some key sources that I'm going to be drawing upon, they're mentioned in my criteria essay, but you can also kind of find them, here on the slide to refer back to in the future. And they often kind of deal with, making meaning from the war and different sites and different kind of conversations that have happened, especially over the past 25, 30 years, to really think about what these commemoration efforts mean to the American people and to kind of our national identity. So to give some further perspective, during and immediately following the war, there were some different ways that kind of the American people and government thought about commemorating the war effort. And we often think today that the country was unified and coming together for the war. And while that was definitely in the ways that, different government campaigns were mobilized at the time, there were also some very diverse experiences and perspectives of what World War II was actually like on the home front. And this often included racial discrimination and other injustices. And so when you're thinking about, really representing these histories accurately and with a lot of nuance, it's important to realize that there's not one monolithic story of World War II, but that there's many different ways that it was experienced in ways that it still needs to be reckoned with today. And some of those injustices, are ongoing in many forms. And so this is a kind of national conversation we need to continue to have. During the war itself, different cultural institutions like museums really sought to balance how the war was being preserved and interpreted. And so that meant that it wasn't necessarily trying to glorify the war effort, but that it was trying to kind of accurately portray what the sentiment was at the time, what these individual experiences were like. And so that's kind of important to know that, when you're thinking about the ways that institutions preserve it today, it is important to kind of reflect on the past and the ways that previous cultural institutions like museums kind of thought about it as the war was happening. So I recommend just kind of reading some of the scholarship I mentioned to just get a further perspective. One other kind of interesting aspect that I did touch upon kind of early on was this concept of a living memorial. And so those are kind of like those honor roll plaques that were embedded within these public use facilities. And these kind of became facilities that, really veterans were honored, but it really thought towards the future and to their legacies. And so this might include, development of different municipal buildings, different public facilities like parks and pools. And so those living memorials actually do live on today, and often they're still in use at the moment. And so it's a very powerful way that the war has been remembered over time. And finally, as I kind of mentioned before around the concept of a peace park, there's really this reflection by the World War II generation as the war was ending, about the true destruction and loss of warfare. And so there was this emphasis of thinking about, what can be learned from this experience of total war, where hundreds of thousands of American lives were lost to the conflict and millions worldwide were killed due to the violence of warfare. And so there was this emphasis on peace, on global friendship, on repair. And that's really something that I think is within the spirit of World War II commemoration. That's really important to think about today, especially as the world, emerges from the COVID-19 crisis, public health crisis, and as different geopolitical, tensions continue to develop. So what can we learn from this incredibly transformational moment within our national and global history that can still be applied to where we are today? And so I think all that's very important to kind of bring into the ways that we think about World War II commemoration. And really what I kind of recommend, and I touch upon my essay, is the idea of striking a balance. And so there is this tendency that's developed, especially since the 50th anniversary of World War II in 1995, of honoring service members, of honoring Homefront workers, of expressing gratitude to the World War II generation who sacrificed so much, who are aging and passing away in record numbers. And all of that is so important in terms of, acknowledging the service of previous generations and all that they have done, to preserve democracy and ensure global peace. But at the same time, there is this tendency, when you commemorate war, that it's possible to kind of valorize militarism. And so when we think about, what the future of the US can be like, do we want it to be one that's rooted within militarization, or do we want one that is rooted within peace? And I think that's, as I say, it always requires a balance. But as we're thinking about World War II commemoration, I think we should also, think back to the experiences of those who, went through the war and kind of their hopes for the future, because I think that can shape the ways that we think about our own future today. And one other aspect to kind of keep in mind is that, when we're representing these different histories and all of their nuances, it's also very possible to start, looking for simple answers and to obscure historical complexities. And so, as we're thinking about, applying to this wonderful NPS program, how can you look within your own local environment and really make sure that, diverse experiences, voices, perspectives are represented, and that the stories that are told are not kind of collapsed into one particular narrative, but it really represents these many diversities. And so this kind of final slide here relates to some of these very complexities, and some of them have to do with civil rights, racial injustice, and some untold stories kind of from the American Homefront that may be helpful to think about and kind of research within your own local environments. So just giving some other examples here that maybe just a little bit less often touched upon. There were the incarceration camps on American soil. There were prisoner of war camps, civilian public service camps. There are U.S. territories, which are also aspects of the American Homefront. There's civil rights and racial justice issues that happened during World War II, and ways that African Americans were excluded from, taking advantage of the bills like the GI Bill for veterans afterwards. There were women and LGBTQ aspects of history, and also these histories of peace and resistance to warfare. And all of these complexities kind of make up our American Homefront history. And they're just very important as we're thinking through the kind of sites and programs that are represented, to just make sure that these complexities also make it into the national narrative. So I will leave you here with some final questions to ponder as you're putting together your own application. Maybe if you're a National Park Service member, as you're starting to review applications. How do World War II memorial sites, commemoration initiatives engage these different narratives, experiences, and communities in their preservation and interpretation of the past? What innovative approaches are used to share these complex histories? And I'm sure that each of you, have been invested in so many important kind of efforts to preserve the past and to engage future generations. And I really look forward to kind of hearing about, your experiences and any questions that you have about this program and my presentation. So thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We've got a couple of comments and questions in the chat that I'll start going through, but please, anyone who has comments or questions, please don't hesitate to pop them in there, and we will hopefully get to all of them. The first comment we have from Donna Graves is that Day of Remembrance for Executive Order 9066's recognition ceremonies for forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans is very widespread in the West, and I think touches on your presentation. Thank you for that comment, Donna. Heather Adkins has a question for you, and they write, our local arsenal that started during World War II is still active. I found out recently that there are still underground munitions storage bunkers on the arsenal, some that have been opened and some not, and many that date to World War II. I need to check with local experts because I think at least one of the bunkers has a historical marker, but the grand majority are more like low-key living legacies of the war due to the nature of the DoD here are not talked about. My question here is, what is your perspective on unspoken legacies?
Thank you so much for sharing, Heather, and for your question. So I am kind of curious about that category of unspoken legacies. Do you mean primarily that these are kind of aspects of wartime history and heritage that continue today, or are they mostly kind of unrecognized sites? I'm just kind of curious what your framing of unspoken and what that means to you. And you're welcome to either unmute yourself or to write a little bit further in the chat.
And just to help give Heather some time to think about either replying in the chat or on screen, I will share another comment that Donna Graves shared in the chat. As someone who's been involved in the creation, establishment, and ongoing health of Rosie the Riveter World War II Historical Park, I'm happy to point people to that park to see how a city can represent a more diverse and complex way of interpreting the World War II home front. I don't know if you have anything to elaborate on that. Erica?
Great to meet you, Donna. And I have had the chance to visit this fantastic park. I think this is a question, for NPS. I'm curious for kind of some of the parks that are currently already kind of recognized within the MPS orbit, are they also eligible to kind of apply to this this program, or is it kind of yeah, I'm curious how these two kind of initiatives may be combining together.
Great. And it looks like Heather has their hand raised. So Heather, you're welcome to come off mute and turn your video on if you would like to share a little bit with us.
I'm going to avoid turning my video on just because my office is a crazy mess. I started writing out my thought process and realized it's too complicated without actually speaking it. Huntsville has a very complex history that people don't really like to talk about. We have the rocket program that NASA Apollo program that was based on, German rocketeers who were part of the Nazi regime. And we have the Arsenal, which is technically a living legacy of World War II, but no one is allowed on the Arsenal despite having historical markers out there. And the presence of the DoD here means so much of our history is kept reasonably quiet, I guess. So we have these different memorialization aspects that I would love to be able to talk about, but there are certain barriers in place here due to how our history is interpreted. So I'm curious, has anyone encountered these types of memorials where you talk about one aspect, but you don't talk about another? And where is that line for talking about these things when it comes to memorialization?
Thank you so much for kind of that further context. So yes, I guess I am kind of curious. Are there any sort of barriers to sharing any aspect of that history since the DoD is involved? Is there any kind of classified information that can't be shared? Is that a concern at all? Or yeah, if you just share a little bit more.
I actually have not run into classified issues yet. There are certainly physical barriers. I think the Arsenal recently has started allowing visitor passes, but it's not something that's widely known. And normally you have to know someone to go see these things that are on the Arsenal. The bigger issue, I think, with talking about World War II legacy is there are so many living German descendants of those German rocketeers here. And every time we have a program that tries to explore this complex history, those descendants end up showing up. And it's usually a really great time. They have wonderful perspectives, but it never ends up we never end up talking about the thing we actually came for because we don't want to step on toes. So there's a bit of a physical barrier with the historical sites. There's a bit of a conscience barrier when it comes to especially the descendants and talking about the larger complexities of our history. So I'm not sure I know how to clarify anymore.
No, that's all very helpful. So I think regarding physical barriers, I mean, that's great to hear that the Arsenal has been kind of opened up a little bit more to the public. So I think that it might be helpful to think a little bit further about those kind of interpretive programs that you mentioned. Are there ways that you've engaged kind of the local community in conversation about these complex histories, or do you have a plan to do that in the future? I guess I'm curious also, Heather, how are you involved in this particular initiative? Are you a historian or educator?
Yes, I'm a public historian. I actually run the archives at the public library system. We're a 10 branch library system, and I like to call us the community's archive. Every other archive in town is university or Space and Rocket Center. We're the only ones that kind of explore everything in between. So at this point, I'm trying to figure out if the library is capable of addressing what it means to be a heritage city. So I have a lot of contacts on the Arsenal in all these historical groups. I happen to also be president of the Historical Society. I have the connections. It's just trying to figure out how it all fits together and who is going to end up putting up a roadblock, essentially. I think a lot of the newest generations of historians that I've met are willing to address those roadblocks. And every time I bring it up with someone who might have been around longer, it's say, oh, no, you can't do that. So so I guess it's partly generational too. Yeah, I feel like I have the connections. I feel like we have the motivation. I feel like it's right that we should be a heritage city. But all the roadblocks that keep popping up, it's hard to say whether people will be willing to go along with it and more than just theory. Yeah, did I actually answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for kind of elaborating and kind of sharing more about some of the different actors that are and collaborators that are factoring into your application. I think that I guess I'm curious just to ask one last one. What do you feel like this Heritage City designation, how would it help your efforts?
That is an excellent question and one I've been struggling with. I I think when I embarked on the webinar series, I thought, oh, this is just so cool and we fit so many of the criteria. But because the DoD is alive and well here, and because, this concerns living descendants and living memorials, it's hard to decide whether or not it's something that should be gone for in the first place. There is a large part of me that says Huntsville in and of itself is a living memorial. Everything we do here is based on what we did in World War II, because that's honestly just a fact. But we look at other places like Mobile who did naval construction and have the beautiful ship as a memorial, as their museum. And I think, is it time for someone else to take that and step up? Am I being greedy here? I don't know what it would mean for us to be a World War II heritage city. I think most people just think, are we not already? Do we need to put a logo on it? Yeah, I'm struggling to figure that out. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure where we would go with it. I know it's purely honorific, and I'm wondering at this point if it's worth the effort for simply PR or, all the things that the administration have asked me over the past 2 weeks. So yeah, again, not sure if I actually answered your question there. I'm still trying to figure it all out. I know that there are a million different ways we meet the criteria. I don't know if anyone else in the city would go beyond saying, aren't we already doing that?
Thank you. I just really appreciate you kind of engaging in conversation. I think, probably others on this call will really benefit from what you shared, as you're thinking about putting your application together. So, I think that there's definitely, for me, and I'm sure like National Park Service representatives here can share more from their perspective, but, I think in getting this kind of designation, there's definitely some aspects of like heritage tourism that play a role, really kind of driving people to come visit the city. I think there's also, ways that, it will facilitate some of those really interesting and nuanced conversations, probably locally as well, if you were to receive that designation, because it just might open up different pathways for people to kind of think about the contributions of your city. So those are just kind of, 2 areas that come to mind of why the designation can be helpful. But, any Dr. Lowe, you're welcome to kind of jump in, or anyone else who might like to kind of share a little bit more about the program.
Well, thank you for that question, Heather. First, as you noted that the designation itself is an honorific. It doesn't automatically come with funding, which is what everyone wants to know. But what it does come with is one, the branding opportunity, not only just through the logo, but also through our website as well, where we link to and share the stories of the jurisdictions that relate to World War II heritage cities, right? So Not to say that the National Park Service doesn't have any barriers to telling these stories, because there might specific detail, might be embargoed or under some type of limited information barrier. We wade into stories that are difficult or challenging or secret all the time. That is our role for the United States, is to preserve and to educate the public about that history, right? So the barriers that you may be experiencing locally in collaboration, that's something that the National Park Service would assist with. In addition to that, not only the branding and the public education piece at the national federal level through agency efforts, you're also, as a World War II heritage city, able to reach the National Park Service for technical assistance, right? So you have all of these questions about what is and isn't appropriate, what is and isn't effective for telling these stories, right? Maybe how you do an oral history project while maintaining confidentiality or preservation of descendant communities. Well, that's the type of thing we in the Park Service do. And one of the benefits of being a heritage city is to be able to access the expertise, interpretive, cultural anthropologist, all of those professional skills that understand the issues which you're referring to. So again, not only the funding and the branding, but also the technical expertise that will get you to the place of kind of problem solve. This year, I just hired Jason Okrasa, who is our new staff historian for the World War II Homefront history. Now that we have more capacity, we'll also be convening those listed American World War II heritage cities. Hopefully in fiscal year 2024, we'll begin to facilitate meetings of our World War II heritage cities, so that you guys as a network can do that type of cross-branding, problem solving, and create networks and relationships to tell the World War II Homefront story. So long answer, but the resources are there as part of the designation.
Thank you so much. And I know that Donna Graves has a question that I think builds on this idea of what more we can do with the program. So I will invite Donna to ask her question now.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Turkaya. This has been great. I've been struck by the limitations of the one city per state program. And especially, Erica, when you were talking about the living memorials category, which in Richmond, the whole civic center is a memorial civic center. So it's Memorial City Hall, Memorial Art Museum. If we didn't have the national park there, nobody would know what it was a memorial to. So given that those kinds of living memorials are strewn throughout the country, it would be great. Or do you think there's some way to leverage this program to help many places at least reconnect that historic meaning?
That's a fantastic question. And I agree that this is kind of those living memorials and even that concept, it really wasn't something I knew about and until I started kind of researching, for this program and the essay that I wrote. And so I think they are a little bit invisible. And I think you make a great point that since your city already has kind of a National Park Service park, that connection is a little bit more visible. And so I do think that, with this program of recognizing particular cities, that living memorials should be included in applications, and that it might then, just become a way to to further show, how the World War II generation really wanted their war and their service to be recognized, immediately following the conflict. But it takes a little bit of time and explanation for the public to fully kind of see that and see the different places across the American landscape where these memorials still live. So I guess I would say, definitely for someone who's considering applying to this program, include that in the application if that's within your local city. But maybe also think about ways where that those living memorials are still being interpreted or are part of kind of the education about local wartime history, because otherwise they're embedded within the landscape and may just not necessarily connect directly back to the war so easily. So I hope that this program could help kind of reconnect that aspect of memorialization a little bit further.
Thanks. I think that that movement towards living memorials wasn't just about World War II vets and others wanting to honor that. It was a whole constellation of, as you said, urban redevelopment, modernism in architecture. I mean, Lewis Mumford wrote that article that I haven't read your essay yet, but I'm sure you reference about living memorials and life. So I think that that connection, the living memorials are connected to a lot of historical aspects of the post-war period, and World War II remembrance is part of it. And it seems like an easy way to bring the past to those sites, but I think it's actually very complicated. Sorry, I went off on that. I'll go off screen now. Thank you. Bye.
Good, great to see you, Donna. And I just wanted to add to that. The National Park Service interprets World War II and the Homefront outside of this program, has been doing it for years, for decades, through our national parks, but through our other programs. We actually have connected with the program various lesson plans and other public education articles that are not just about the designated cities, but are about the Homefront history generally, right? And so since we are place-based, we will be capturing other places that are not necessarily World War II heritage cities through our digital resources, through our website, through our lesson plans, through our teaching with historic places, and travel itineraries that we prepare and have prepared. So the program not only is a designation program, but it's also an interpretive and public education program as well that can capture the histories of other places. And as you know, Donna, we're always looking for people to work with us to develop the content.
Thank you so much for that. I think we might have time for one more question if someone wants to pop one into the chat, but I also wanted to draw attention to a comment from Sean Krieger saying, "This is a wonderful program and I'm happy to learn about it. The Virgin Islands played a major role in the World War II effort for the United States within the Caribbean. In St. Thomas, there was a submarine base, Army base, and a naval marine base. In St. Croix, there was an Army air base and naval port. Unfortunately, many of these sites are poorly maintained. The Virgin Islands State Historic Preservation Office has been advocating for the preservation of our World War II sites in the territory and recently started the development of a National Register nomination for U.S. military sites in St. Thomas. I plan to expand this nomination to include sites in St. Croix. There are other sites and features I've not discussed that are present in the Virgin Islands, and I just wanted to draw attention to that recollection that there are other jurisdictions that are eligible for these nominations, and to build on Dr. Lowe's comments about NPS's work beyond just this designation program. And one project that the National Council on Public History is also collaborating with the Park Service on is not only an update to the 2007 Homefront theme study, but also to expand to include smaller studies and histories for each of the states and territories that were in existence during the time of World War II and made contributions to the home front. So we are continuing to work and actually have a meeting next month to talk about other ways to share this information and the products coming out of these collaborations, the lesson plans, the travel itineraries, the other histories. So hopefully you all will hear more from us and from scholars like Erica. Thank you again for joining us today, for contributing to this essay series, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Thank you, of course, to Dr. Lowe and the National Park Service for working with NCPH on this. Thank you to all of you for participating, and we will follow up later this week to share recordings of all 6 of the presentations that were part of this series. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.